Welcome to the America's Public Forum featuring John B. Judis. John is has been an institution of American commentary journalism on various historical and political and intellectual issues for many, many years. And he's written about a variety of subjects, from American identity to the nature of the American political parties, to the role that various ideological movements have played in American political life. He has a whole list of books out there, but I'll just read off a few of them because you may have heard of some of these. He was the co-author of a book that came out in 2002, I believe, called The Emerging Democratic Majority, which has been cited many, many, many times about the state of coalitions on the American left, and has been the subject of many fascinating debates on the question of whether there will be a future partisan majority like there was at so many previous times in American history. In, I think, the 90s, he co-authored an article with somebody who's actually been on this podcast and who are on this event, who I believe is actually in the audience right now, Michael Lind, on the new nationalism, and wrote about how a Theodore Roosevelt style and Franklin Roosevelt style way of doing politics was something that was becoming possible with some of the trends of the post-Cold War world. In 2016, he started writing a trilogy of books, the third of which is the one that we're going to discuss now. But as you can tell by the titles, he was kind of on top of the trends that many have been discussing. In 2016, he wrote The Populist Explosion: How the Great Recession Transformed American and European Politics. In 2018, he wrote The Nationalist Revival: Trade, Immigration, and the Revolt Against Globalization. And the book that we currently will be discussing is his latest book, published in 2020, The Socialist Awakening: What's Different Now About the Left. Ibrahim, if you can post the link to that in the chat box. So he's written a lot of different books on a lot of different important subjects, and we are really honored to have him here. So John, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and it's a pleasure, and it's very nice to have some old friends there in the audience too. So you originally wanted me to talk for an hour. That was just way beyond my capabilities. I'll talk for less than that, and I'll sort of use my own life story in order to take up part of the time. I became a socialist sometime in the mid-late 60s. Influenced a lot by civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the idea that there was a American system that had somehow gotten us into this war in Vietnam. But a lot of people in the New Left did not become socialists. And I think one of the reasons that I did was my upbringing. I was raised in Chicago in what could fairly be said a great degree of wealth. We lived in the Drake Towers, which was the fanciest apartment building in Chicago. And we were on the 14th floor, and on the 15th floor was the Pritzker family you might be familiar with from Obama, Hyatt, Regency, all those hotels. So that was my upbringing until I was about 12 years old. My parents were in the dress business in Chicago. And about then, largely because of the interstate commerce, the interstate highway, the dress business started moving to the coast, to particularly Los Angeles and New York. And my parents went out of business, and then they put all their money in a store in Palm Beach, Florida, and that went under. And what really happened was that I spent my teens with a family that had become pretty dysfunctional. Both of my parents became, I think it's fair to say, alcoholics. And I went to school on scholarships from then on. And when I would come home, I'd have to answer the phone from bill collectors. So I just want to say that because I think in the back of my mind, and one of the reasons that I ended up as a socialist and not as, let's say, a liberal anti-war person, was the idea that there was something wrong with capitalism, and that fact, it had something to do with what had happened to my own family when I was a teenager. As it turns out, my parents got back on their feet, but it was by then I was out of college and in my 20s. But that was a rough time. The kind of socialism that I became, the kind of socialist in the late 60s, early 70s, was pretty much an orthodox Marxist socialist. I believe that socialism was public ownership and control of the means of production. I wasn't sure, but I didn't think there would be such things as markets and private enterprise. I thought people would own their own homes, but beyond that, everything would be social. Everything would be socialized in that sense. It was a little like as if we thought that it would be what the United States would be like would be the Soviet Union if it were really truly democratic. So you'd have central planning plus democracy. And that was pretty much in the back of my mind in the early 1970s when I was an editor of a journal called, believe it or not, Socialist Revolution. And when I worked with the New American Movement, which was an organization that later became the Democratic Socialists of America. It merged with another organization to form DSA. So about, let's say, 1976, 1977, I started to think to myself, well, what does it really mean to be a socialist? What is socialism? How is socialism going to arrive? What are the steps by which we go from where we are now, it was the Carter administration, to something like socialism? And I began to think about how it could actually work. Would the government take over everything? Well, in that case, you could have a situation where a government controlled basically the politics and the economy of the society. That's again a formula for authoritarianism, not for democracy. If workers controlled each of the factories, how would that work? It became very uncertain to me what it really meant. When I was on the Socialist Revolution, people used to call me the little black cloud because I was very pessimistic. I thought that it would take 10 or 15 years for a revolution to come. At that time, believe it or not, people were thinking about 5 years, 6 years. By 1976, 77, what is a revolution going to be? Armed struggle, how is it going? So the very idea of socialism became unmoored. I no longer knew what I meant by it, what I thought about it. At the time, I read a book by Karl Loveth called Meaning in History. And Loveth was a student of Heidegger along with Hannah Arendt, became an exile, was not on the right, he was more on the left. But what he argued in Meaning in History was that Marxism itself was a kind of, had a kind of eschatology at the heart of it. The revolution itself is Armageddon. The socialism where you hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, and write compose symphonies in the evening was a kind of post-millennial vision. That there was a religious element, and I recognize that also in myself, and as something that I myself was looking for. Of course, I was an atheist, et cetera, but again, I think that it's a part of our makeup that we seek that kind of vision. It's part of the way we can overcome fear of death, thinking that there is this kind of millennium in store for us. So I became convinced again that Marxism itself, not as an analysis of capitalism, but as a politics and as a vision of the future, was really quasi-religious in that sense. It was not something that was grounded in, as Marx would say, science. So 80s or so, 1980s, I really thought of myself as a kind of Herbert Crowley progressive. And that was the spirit in which I think I cooperated with Mike to write our piece on the new nationalism. About that same time, though, I began to rethink what socialism meant. I was very influenced by a guy named Marty Sklar, a historian. And what Marty argued was that the Marxist theory of history, the idea that there were stages, and there was feudalism, capitalism, and socialism, and each would be punctuated by evolution, was basically wrong. And that what was happening was that elements of socialism were being introduced within capitalism, just as elements of capitalism became introduced in feudalism. Those elements might someday predominate or they might not. But again, if you look at the history of the 20th century, you see very much an alteration between one and the other. You get the New Deal, its reforms, you get the Great Society, but then you go backwards with Reagan and with the Republican Congress. So it goes back and forth, but within that, there's an attempt to create socialism within capitalism. But it was, for me, that was a theoretical insight. It wasn't something that had to do with practical politics. Now switch to Bernie Sanders for a moment. Bernie goes to, well, we are incidentally almost exactly the same age, I think 17 days apart. He goes to Vermont, I go to Berkeley. In Vermont, he's very much, he's not, like me, he never became a member of the hard right. He was not a Marxist-Leninist. I didn't have pictures of Mao or Stalin or, God help us, Kim Il-sung. There were actually people like that on the wall. He was from the beginning somebody who thought that socialism had to be democratic, but his idea of it was very much influenced by Marx and Eugene V. Debs, the Socialist Party, who again had this idea that socialism was public ownership and control of all the means of production. So that's Bernie as he goes to Vermont and as he runs as the candidate of the Liberty Party. And he still had those kind of ideas when he was the mayor of Burlington. He confessed that he couldn't nationalize the banks because that wasn't within his powers as mayor of Burlington. In 1989, though, as he's making his second run for Congress, his first being unsuccessful. So he's running for the 1990 election. He changes his views, and he now describes himself as a Swedish-style socialist. And socialism becomes things like, he didn't use those words now. I think he talked about single-payer health insurance, but Medicare for all, free college, exactly the kind of things that he became identified with. In other words, he too began to see socialism within capitalism. But the difference between Bernie and me was that he was a politician, and lo and behold, in 2015, he runs for president as a democratic socialist, and in terms of these same ideas, and he almost gets the Democratic nomination. At that point, for me, socialism became not just a theory, but again, a viable politics. How viable, we'll get to in a minute. Now, where does Bernie's support come from? And how does this somehow arise? How does socialism become a practical politics? Even before Sanders runs in 2015, you find these kind of anomalies in opinion polls where if you ask, if I can use the words, am I old enough to use the word kids without insulting people? Kids 18 to 29, if you ask them, 49% think socialism would be better than capitalism, something like that. These very odd results start coming out. What was happening, in my opinion, is that they were part of a post-Cold War generation. I mean, we grew up, those of us who were born in 1940, 1950, 1960, 1970, part of the Cold War as a generation that, for the most part, identified socialism with the Soviet Union and with a lack of democracy. These were kids who came of age after that and who didn't have that kind of identification. two experiences I think were important in forming their ideas about capitalism and socialism. The most important was the Great Recession. These were, again, people who go out of college, they get out of college, and they find that their expectations about having a job and moving up the ladder are not being fulfilled. They might also very well have large student debts. Secondly, they find that they become worried about climate change. For these generations, climate change, I think, is something like the fear of nuclear war was for the people who grew up in the 1950s. I mean, we used to really fear every time. I remember every time we'd go down Lakeshore Drive in Chicago, there was a big V2 missile battery there. I'd see it, you know, a chill would go down my spine. We really worried that there would be a nuclear war. I think in a very similar way, that's the threat of climate change has the same kind of importance for the mentality of kids who grew up, let's say, born in 1984, 85. They see it, again, as a product of an unregulated capitalism. So you had both these things. You have a Great Recession capitalism that fails in expectations, and you have climate change. And I think that what happens is not so much that this generation becomes attached to the idea of socialism, but because they become skeptical of capitalism. And insofar as they're skeptical of capitalism, they become open to some kind of socialism. And what Bernie did really is give that idea of democratic socialism some kind of substance. When I used to, when I covered the campaigns, I interviewed a lot of people who at the Sanders rallies. I used to describe them as the grandparents and their children, because it was like people from the 60s, and then it was their grandchildren, with the middle generation entirely missing. They again would talk about socialism as cooperation. Again, an idea of socialism that's pre-Marxist, that goes back to Christian ideas, the Sermon on the Mount, cooperation rather than competition, altruism rather than selfishness. And they talk about the models of Denmark, Sweden, the kind of welfare state that they have there that provides a cushion for people that would alleviate the anxieties that people growing up and people who have already grown up feel about their fate, especially when we're in times like this or during the Great Recession. Those were the kind of ideas, and I think that that Bernie, to a great extent, filled out the picture for them and made it possible for a socialist politics as such to emerge in a way that I could never imagine. I was talking to people in San Francisco this morning. Of course, I wasn't there. It was the same kind of Zoom thing, and I described to them how in, I think it was 1974, 1975, Robert Schaefer might remember the exact date. The New American Movement had a chapter in San Francisco, and we ran a candidate for the Board of Supervisors who ran as a socialist, a woman named Karen. And she was not a bad campaigner. I mean, she could talk and things like that, and did leaflets and all that stuff. And I think there were 4 seats open, and she came in 16th. And right ahead of her was a guy named Jesus Christ Satan. So you can get an idea from that of how viable a socialist politics rather than analysis was in 1974 and 1975. So that's really changed in America. And the main reason I think that it's changed is, again, this upsurge of skepticism about capitalism among the young, and the way that the 2 Sanders campaigns gave some substance to it. Now let me talk a little about what that could mean for the future. Let me get a drink here so I lose my voice. From from the way I describe my own understanding of socialism, not as something that happens afterwards, that's a kind of post-millennial event, but as something that can happen within capitalism as power shifts from business to labor, as workers gain some control over their own livelihood, as institutions and industries that don't work in the public interest are either effectively regulated or, if that doesn't work, taken over. And that's, again, something we're talking about. That's an issue with healthcare, energy, transportation, and education in the United States already. It's not an issue with the steel industry or the auto industry or whatever. So that's that kind of idea of socialism. If you think about it, if you think of the candidates, if you think of politics now, there are a lot of people besides Bernie Sanders who have these ideas who don't describe themselves as socialists. In the campaign itself, there really wasn't that much difference between Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. People could pick out differences there were, but on some issues, let's say on finance, she might have been to the left of Bernie Sanders. In the Congress, there's a progressive caucus, 95 Democrats, again, pretty much endorsed the whole Sanders agenda. Medicare for all, Green New Deal, free college, no student debt, the whole thing. If you look again at magazines now, and if you even look at the subparts of the New York Times editorial page, there are people advocating these ideas, but not advocating them on behalf of socialism as a noun. So what I'd say is that along with this upsurge of explicit socialist politics, what you also have is the growth of a kind of shadow socialism. Politicians, movements, publications who espouse many of the same ideas, but for instance, if they're a senator in a state with a population that's a little different from Vermont, feel that it's not in their interest to present themselves as socialists, because they're still, and this was again an absolute roadblock to Bernie getting the nomination, and I think would have hurt him significantly if he had gotten the nomination. For people 40 years old or 45 years more older, the identification of socialism with the Soviet Union or even Venezuela and Cuba still is strong. So to present these ideas as socialists doesn't make much sense to a lot of politicians, yet we have this kind of growth of a socialist politics. So that's the kind of situation that we're in now. Now let me talk about a little about the particular challenges we face in the country at the moment. We have a pandemic and a recession, both of which I think I fear are going to last at least another year, and it's going to take us a while to recover economically even after that. These kind of crises really challenge the Americans' default suspicion of big government, which has again been an obstacle to any idea about socialism, about public control. We're in a time now where really the question isn't big versus small government, but it's what kind of big government you want and on behalf of whom. So what we're facing, in the book, I talk about the theorist Karl Polanyi, who wrote a book called The Great Transformation. And in it, he described the situation in the late 1920s and early 30s when, you had capitalism breaking down all over the place, the gold standard, laissez-faire capitalism, and where you had the growth of big government, but it could go in many different ways. And in the United States, it went towards the New Deal. In Central Europe and Southern Europe, it went towards fascism. So it can go many different ways. And that's the kind of crossroads that we're at. And there's interesting things happening. There's not only among the Democrats this kind of shadow socialism that's pushing Biden to espouse things that you wouldn't imagine that he would have favored, let's say, in whatever, 1988 when he first ran for president, or in 2008. You also have among some Republicans and Republican intellectuals, and I'm thinking of the journal American Affairs and the think tank American Compass, a reevaluation of government intervention in the economy and support for something called industrial policy, which was, used to be something that only a Democrat would consider viable, as well as a friendly nod toward unions, again, something characteristic of Democrats than Republicans. So you have this kind of, this kind of what could turn out to be a convergence toward a new kind of intervention, government intervention, part of which at least would be driven by these ideas of shadow socialism. Now, what about beyond that? What are the prospects? I guess we could say now that it's pretty likely that Biden will win the election. I'd be even more surprised than in 2016 if Trump wins this election. But again, will he put forward these kind of ideas as president? And what I think you have to look for in asking whether this shadow socialism or explicit socialism will become a viable pathway, whether again, you'll have big government as defined by the left. You have to look for two kinds of things. The first is there going to be sufficient organization from below that's pushing politicians in that direction and pushing a government in that direction? And I'd have to say that right now, the answer would probably be no. I mean, the major role that the major institution that served that purpose for the New Deal and afterwards was the labor movement. The labor movement is now reduced to about 10% of the non-farm workforce. It really doesn't have the kind of clout that it used to have. So it's not going to be able to push us forward. The left itself, very much organized through social media, and I'm thinking again of the kind of protests that have occurred over the last 6 months. That's not going to do the trick. I mean, the obvious example is Egypt and the various spring movements there, which were easily manipulated and really went nowhere. You have to have organization of some kind. You have to have real organization. And it's going to be very difficult to develop that in the United States. One thing that a Biden administration could do would be to reform our labor laws and to appoint people to the National Labor Relations Board who won't try to screw workers every time they try to form a union and are blocked by business. But there's serious structural problems that face unions. So the workforce itself isn't like it was in the 1930s. You don't have the same kind of huge blue-collar factories where everybody is in the same place and can be easily organized. And it's become even crazier during this pandemic where people are working remotely. So again, there's huge obstacles. Leadership, you have to have, again, you don't have to have something called socialism. I don't care what it's called. It can be called progressivism, but there has to be a comprehensive leadership. There has to be somebody who's bringing these ideas together. And really what we have now is a kind of missing generation. If you look at the polls themselves, the Biden-Trump polls, there's this very odd kind of thing happens where the group that Biden is weakest among is, I think it's 45 through 60-year-olds. You have this kind of missing middle, and you have that itself within the congressional and political leadership in the country. You have Sherrod Brown, Sanders, Elizabeth Warren. They're all people late 60s, 70s. And on the other hand, you have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, people in their late 20s or early 30s. And these are primarily people who come from cosmopolitan, metropolitan areas, post-industrial areas that represent not simply a certain kind of politics, but a certain kind of culture that puts them at odds with a lot of the rest of the country, the small town, mid-sized town America, the kind of places that suffered from deindustrialization, where, you know, it's a lot of the politics of gender or defunding the police or reparations just seems incomprehensible. So again, I think among the younger generation, and this also goes for the organized socialist movement, Democratic Socialists of America, they are as much an expression of a particular culture as of a politics. And it's a culture which really reinforces the kind of divisions that we have in America. Because if you want to have a functional left in America, if you want to have either, you know, shadow socialism or socialism, if you want to have a society that puts people before profits, you basically have to unite the bottom and the middle of the society against the very top, against the most powerful who are holding these kind of reforms back. You can't do that as long as we suffer the kind of divisions that we now suffer within our polity. Part of the reason that I'm so eager to get rid of Trump is that he has, to an extent way beyond that of the cosmopolitan left, or however you want to put that, reinforced those divisions and really polarized our society in a very destructive way. Because in order to have any kind of reforms, you know, we have to have a common understanding of ourselves as Americans who are committed to something like the same future, so that if I pay a lot of taxes in order to fund, let's say, Medicare for all or what have you, I have to believe that somebody who's going to benefit from those taxes deserves it, even if I don't know the person, even if I'll never see the person. But if we have the kind of divisions that we have now in the society, it's very hard to pull that off. And to pull it off, the left will need leadership. And the leadership right now, I'm afraid to say, is lacking. So we need both organization and we need leadership. I expect if the Biden years to be a kind of transitional period. And it wouldn't shock me if we were back to the Republicans in 2024. So we're going to be going through this over the next decade. But I think the politics now are a lot different from what they were 10, 15, or 20 years ago. And again, I think that there has been a socialist awakening of America. It's just not clear, again, where it's going to lead to over the next 10 or 20 years. So anyway, I welcome your questions. I think my cat is complaining about the door being shut, but we'll see.
Well, John, I hope I speak on behalf of more than just myself, but I think this has been a wonderful exposition of a really fascinating body of work, and I look forward to hearing everybody else's questions. So everybody, if you have questions, feel free to start putting up your blue hands. I'll just start off with 2 questions for John to help frame this a little further before we go in, and we'll have about 40 minutes with him to do this conversation here. So John, you mentioned some things about the bipartisan nature of this, and you mentioned specifically American Affairs and American Compass. And I guess kind of hovering above this is it really possible to envision, say, Elizabeth Warren working on labor policy with Josh Hawley or Marco Rubio working on a combination of industrial policy and immigration policies with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Is that kind of alignment between progressive socialists and conservative, like communitarian or nationalist economic thinkers, maybe not necessarily real now, but do you think it's something that could be a real cross-partisan and cross-values kind of thing in the future?
Well, we'll see, but there already has been, Josh Hawley and Sherrod Brown have worked together on bills, and he also has worked with Tammy Baldwin from Wisconsin on a trade bill. So it's possible, and I would hope that the Congress won't be conducted in the same way in the next 4 years as it has been in the past. So, but again, those are only 2 or 3 people among the Republicans. So we'll have.
Well, we all can hope. So, and the second thing is goes back to the intellectual and cultural backdrop. I sense one of the big problems a lot of Reds, a lot of even just general centrist types have with socialism is it just seems so alien as a concept. We fought the whole Cold War over this. It seems like such a thing that's antithetical, if perhaps not in fact, then at least an idea to basic American values like individualism and individual opportunity and enterprise and those things. So you've explained a little bit how it can help bolster a free society, but how would you specifically refer to or respond to charges on that line specifically?
I plead the guilty. I mean, those were the kind of doubts that I had in the 1980s and 1990s. And it wasn't because of me, it was because of this change that happened in the beginning of this century in response to the Great Recession, where young people are reevaluating what capitalism and socialism mean. And they're reevaluating it very much in line with, to my surprise, with the way that some of us who were just in purely the theoretical business had been thinking in the 1990s, the idea, again, of socialism occurring within capitalism. So again, it may be that the idea of socialism will not be developed in such a way that it's palatable to a majority of Americans. But to my surprise, something is going on.
Well, with that, we're going to go ahead and start opening to questions. I would only ask the questioners to keep your question to under about 30 seconds if you can. I will mute you or otherwise start tamping it down if your question starts to become a speech. And on that note, I would ask that all the questions here be asked in the form of a question, please. So we want to hear your thoughts, but we want to hear them as questions to the speaker, though. So with that, we'll try to get everybody in. We have about 35 minutes of question time. So with that, Ray English, can you please unmute yourself and ask a question of John?
Yes, I was interested just from your perspective, if you see potential for change coming from within capitalism. And I'm thinking of things like, if you think about efforts to address climate change within this country, a lot of those are not coming from Washington, they're coming from corporations that want to reduce emissions. They're coming from things like the Business Roundtable that talked about beginning to rethink capitalism. There's a book by Rebecca Henderson called Reimagining Capitalism and the like. The basic idea here is stakeholder capitalism. Just wondering what you think about that as the potential for change.
Thank you, Ray.
You're absolutely right about the citing the Business Roundtable. There have been several reports like that by business organizations calling for a reevaluation of how businesses conduct themselves and attacking short-termism. In other words, conducting business with an idea towards increasing stock value in the short term in order to enrich stockholders and CEOs, and not for the public interest. So, again, we'll have to see whether businesses follow through on that. The pattern in American history, and also in, I think this also fits in Europe, is that you get these kind of populist movements like Trump or Sanders, and they provide an early warning that there's trouble, that the usual way of doing things isn't working, that supply side economics hasn't worked, that trade deals that allow corporations to move overseas to avoid wages and regulations, they're not working, that something has to be done. And what has happened with the New Deal, with Huey Long's movement, was responsible to a great extent for the second New Deal in 1935, because, again, the powers that be decided, well, we've got to do something about this or else. Well, Trump, to some extent, is an or else. Especially in the 2016 campaign. I mean, he brought to the surface issues that in the course of his presidency, he hasn't necessarily done much about, but that were very important. Again, the idea of runaway shops. He used to attack the Oreo, the Nabisco, which was moving its factories from Chicago to Mexico, and then you read that he called for a boycott, and then later you learn that on Air Force One he was eating Oreos. So it was very typical of Trump. But again, he raised these issues: the China trade, our loss of manufacturing jobs to China, and the acquiescence in our trade relations with China, which again are based upon a relationship with a country that limits its own consumption, so that necessarily they're going to have big trade surpluses with others and other parts of the country, other parts of the globe, while we become we become beholden to them, and we lose a lot of our key industry. So again, he raises those issues. So what usually happens in American politics or in European is that at some point the establishment, the political leadership comes together and tries to accommodate itself. I think that's some of what is happening in the beginnings with the Business Roundtable and people like that, who are beginning really to worry about inequality in America, who are again worried about short-termism in terms of business planning. But where it's going to go, again, not clear.
Next question will go to Susan. Susan, unmute yourself and ask the question, please.
Hi, thank you so much. I just want to know what your opinion is. What's the difference, John, between your definition of socialism and things like farm subsidies, oil, gas, coal subsidies, automobile subsidies, even military, infrastructure, public education, that kind of thing?
Well, I can't speak with that. I mean, there are really no military subsidies, right? The military is a branch of the United States government, and as far as public education, yeah, that you could say was one of the very earliest attempts at socialism within capitalism. So farm subsidies, again, that's a tricky issue because it depends who the farm subsidies go to, on behalf of what purpose. Trump has used them in order to deflect opposition from the effects of the China tariffs and China's retaliation. That's not socialism, but you could imagine, I mean, land grant colleges, research and development to aid productivity in agriculture, those, again, are all part of socialist public institutions within capitalism.
It does bring up a very fascinating question about to what degree the New Deal was socialist versus to what degree the New Deal was capitalist as well. So,
Right, but and part was and part wasn't. I mean, again, you know, with Social Security, people are now attacking it as a racist legislation because in order to win Southern votes, Roosevelt had to hedge on who was covered and stuff. But you know, as it has evolved as again, not simply an insurance system, but a redistributive means of making people like me in our old age feel more secure. And what is put out is a lot more than what goes in terms of income. It's a progressive reform. So in that sense, yes. National Labor Relations Act of 1935 was intended to, again, to shift the balance away from corporate power toward giving workers more say over their wages, benefit, workplace. It's been completely eroded now. I mean, the Labor Department under Trump is pretty much a joke, but that was its original purpose.
I'm going to take my MC's prerogative real quick to just let you know, John, that you mentioned that you are almost the same age as Bernie Sanders, and I swear I'm not trying to flatter you at all, but I would never have guessed that.
Well, that's great.
Yeah. All right, so next question is going to go to Tomer Applebaum. Tomer, ask a question.
For some context, my great-grandfather died in a Russian gulag for the financial crime of being in a business that offered its services to people freely. And my grandmother...
Make sure to keep this in...
Yeah, I'll keep it short. And my grandmother watched the starving farmers in Ukraine who managed to escape the army to come to the city to die from starvation because they didn't like the collectivization of the means of production on their account. They've been free for about 30 years and actually own their land, and the Marxists wanted to take it away from them. I'm gonna make my question short, Luke. The West ideals is basically we value the individual. The individual is divine. And the socialist, Marxist ideals of equality glorifies...
Tomer, I appreciate your experience, but I need you to ask this as a question.
It's also breaking up. Maybe it's my audio.
Is it that every single Marxist and socialist state are the example of the most horrible abuses of people's rights and the most failed states in the world, and under capitalism, worldwide poverty has been decreasing at an unprecedented rate, and the best countries in the world for the people living in them are capitalist? Can you please resolve that? And
Excellent.
God, I hope that Trump wins again and you're going to be even more surprised in 2016.
Excellent question. Thank you, Tomer. John?
Well, I mean, the whole thrust of what I've been saying is that there are different meanings of socialism, and that we're coming upon a meaning that's much more similar, let's say, to social democracy in Europe than it is to anything resembling the Soviet Union or China or Cuba. And that democracy is part of our heritage. And so again, what I've been trying to say is that the meaning of socialism has begun to change in America. For this person, it hasn't. It's still, again, you, if I can refer to you, I can't remember his name, have an understanding of socialism that many people in America still have. And if that continues, then the kind of politics I describe is going to have to come under a different name.
And thank you again for the question, Tomer. Next question is going to go to Joe Mueller.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got a question regarding Venezuela since John brought that up, but I want to give Tomer relax. I just did a motorcycle ride through North Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas 6 days. I saw a whole bunch of Trump flags and signs. So the people with dirty fingernails and people actually doing the work, it's all going to be okay, bud. Okay, regarding Venezuela, I got it. Hang on, Luke, I'll get you. Okay, so 20 years ago, Chavez comes into Venezuela. free stuff for everybody. They don't take care of their oil and gas fields. They go bankrupt. Today, the average Venezuelan cannot afford food, toilet paper, water, anything. So now we got Biden, who doesn't really know what day it is. He's agreed to a 110-page manifesto with Bernie. And then you got AOC. I've got it, Luke. I'm fixing to ask you. Okay, AOC's about ready to shut down the oil and gas fields. So what's different? I got no use for it.
Thank you, Joe. John, question is, what is different about the Biden administration's plan from Venezuela?
Venezuela? Oh, I don't know enough about Venezuela. I'm not a big fan of Chavez or Maduro. Just take that as a statement by that person. I don't have a good response.
All right. Next question is going to go to Erica. Erica, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. Yeah, I wonder if John can talk a little bit about the idea of worker-owned and operated enterprises and whether he sees any pathway toward that in this country. Thank you.
There are such enterprises, and they're mostly small scale. I think that what we could envisage is something like what the Germans had. Goes back to after World War II, the idea of co-determination, where you have worker representatives on boards of directors, and where the workers have some real say in the main decisions that a company makes. We certainly could have. We have a lot of co-ops and things like that in this country, but I don't know if that's a viable strategy for large-scale business right now.
Next question will be from Sam Klinger. Sam? Sam, you're still on mute. There you go. Yep, you're good.
So my question is, given that capitalists and most mainstream politicians and figures today are very resistant towards actual socialism, do you think some kind of compromise, such as some kind of Disraeli and one nation conservatism or corporatism or Bismarckian socialism, is a more viable alternative?
Well, again, I think that the debate really is one nation's Disraeli. Let me think. I'm just trying to think about what you're asking. Again, what I'm saying is that people are resistant still to socialism, but they're not resistant to some socialist ideas. There's a lot of support in the country, for instance, for the idea of a public option. So the government would provide alongside private insurance a public option. Now you could say, well, that has nothing to do with socialism, but as the ideas have evolved in the last 20 years, that is what socialism means to a lot of Americans. So again, I think that those kind of proposals, those kind of ideas are viable now. And you could see them, some of them coming into being with the Biden administration. But as I said, I think that he's going to be under a lot of pressure from the donor class, as it's called, and from business lobbies. And so, you'll see a clash of interests and how it's going to come out in the end. What kind of things a Biden administration could do is I'm still not sure about.
Next question goes to Kenita Watson. Kenita, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question. Kenita?
Oh.
Kenita, can you hear me? All right, in that case, next question is going to go to Cynthia Sturl. Cynthia?
Hi, this is actually her husband, Larry. Both of us are here. We're obviously sharing the camera, but I'm curious as to the idea that Andrew Yang promoted during the primaries and in subsequent discussion, the sense that, technology is going to continue to become more of a tool, and he's promoting the idea of a basic income. Where does that fit in this concept of, if you will, evolution towards at least another component of our society that's somewhat socialist? And does that start to move things along in that direction, like Social Security has and Medicare has, and so forth?
Yeah, good question. In my view, the idea of a guaranteed annual income is un-American. It really does rub wrong against Americans' Protestant ethic of the idea that you should earn a living, you should have a job. But I think that what we're learning in the face of this pandemic and this recession is that there needs to be some kind of floor beneath which Americans can't go, can't fall, and that the floor we have now is insufficient. It has to be considerably higher in terms of guaranteed health care. Some part of that might be the form of tax credits and benefits and a guaranteed annual income. But the idea that there should be for everybody, instead of an income that would to live on so that you wouldn't have to work, I think is anathema to too many Americans, and really is not something that's viable here. I think too that this is a hard subject and not one on which I am any means an expert, but I think that he overstates the havoc that automation is going to wreak upon our industry and jobs. We haven't seen it yet. I think the manufacturing jobs that were lost were primarily due to China and trade in Mexico, and not to automation. So, we have to see. I think there's a lot of room to enlarge our service sector. So again, I would look toward government programs that lead to jobs rather than to a guaranteed annual income.
Kenita Watson, I see you put your hand up again. Did you get your audio working? Kenita, would you like to unmute yourself? All right. Oh, there we go.
Hi.
Whoa.
Okay, I will unmask myself as a libertarian to start with. And basically that—
You have 30 seconds, Kenita.
Yes, I understand. Just wanted to say that was where I was coming from. That the, government's too big, it needs to be shrunk a bunch, so lots of taxes, which seems to be where a lot of these programs would have to go, is going to be a problem, given that the left and the right basically seem to all come down to being controlled by the corporations who bribe both sides to get what they want. And I'm not sure how the people are going to end up winning whichever side wins.
That actually, John, I'm very interested in what you think on that front.
Well, to some extent, I dealt with that. The corporations don't control the left, and to a great extent, they don't even control the right. I mean, they don't control Trump. I mean, he's from their standpoint, he's out of control. But business has a tremendous amount of power in the society. It's easier. Marx wrote about this, believe it or not, but it's much easier for the bourgeoisie to organize than the proletariat. They're smaller, they're more centralized. So we do face a problem if we want to change the balance of power between labor and capital. We need better organization from below and better leadership. One of the things I didn't talk about that much in the talk But I sort of touched on in the end is, I think to a great extent, the country's being driven nuts by Trump. And what I'm thinking about is both the extremes of the left and the right. On the one hand, the QAnon and all that stuff, the skepticism about science. On the other hand, abolish the police and abolish prisons, which is really, believe it or not, a demand of the Democratic Socialists of America. So you really, or take the issue of immigration. Again, I think that's an issue that the way that Trump has dealt with it has led many Democrats and people on the left to embrace the exact opposite, which is to say open borders, and that we should have no border security, that there shouldn't be some very clearly defined difference between citizens and everybody else, which, you know, what I would say is essential to a democracy and a welfare state. So what I would hope is that the clouds will lift after November 3rd, and that we'll be able to think about our future and our country in a clearer way, and we won't have these kind of really crazy extremes.
We are starting to run up on time, so I'm just going to take another about 3 questions or so, so that we don't take up too much of John's time this evening. I want to go to the question from Joseph Palacios, please. Joseph, unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you very much. My question is related to organizational power on the left. And I'd like to know if you were a consultant, advising progressive groups, how to structure themselves in a similar way or some kind of like way to the conservatives that have organizational power via or evangelical churches and the networks that they have there. Given that you said that the labor unions have become weakened with only 10% of our workers in the unions, where do we go in terms of organizing people on the left with socialist ideas or socialist light ideas to think about organizing versus more ephemeral social movements?
Thank you, Joseph.
Yeah, these are all good questions. They're too hard. You're going to wear me out, you know. I was a left-wing apparatchik for the New American Movement from 1970 to 1976, and I became so disillusioned with my own role that from I'd say like December 1976 to the present, I have not attended a single political meeting. Again, I think I'm almost the last person to consult on this subject. I mean, again, what I'd say is that it's very important to have some kind of organizations for workers. And they may not, the current structure of unions may not work, but there has to be something. And as long as people are atomized, separated, and don't have any kind of formal organization like that, it's going to be very hard to wield a kind of counterweight towards the power of business. There's also political organizations as well, but those can't be organized simply through social media. They have to have some face-to-face element. They have to work within towns and cities and nationally, things like that. So I think those are the two elements. And if you think of, again, if you think of not simply of socialism, but again of this idea of shadow socialism, there are a lot of publications, there are think tanks, Economic Policy Institute, places like that are doing that kind of work that's consistent with those ideas. So it's not as if as if we're living within a political desert on the left. There are a lot of things, but they're not organized yet in a way that can really wield power.
Second to last question is going to go to Niels Brubacher. Niels?
Yeah, thank you. So you mentioned Bernie Sanders earlier, and you also said that that you thought that the social democratic movement in this country is lacking leadership. And so I'm asking, what was missing in Bernie Sanders' leadership of that movement?
Well, Bernie did a great job. He's also, again, well, he's now 79. He's, he's past it. You can't, I wouldn't go out and organize politics. We need younger people to do it. What was lacking in terms of his campaign was some credibility as somebody who could beat Trump. And I think that was the thing that really killed him and made it possible for Biden to win the nomination. Skepticism, again, for 40, 45 years and older about a socialist candidate being able to win an election in America. I'm not going to argue that those people were wrong. And it's particularly true, I think, for older African Americans who are one of the most, in my experience as a journalist, realistic voters in America in terms of gauging their needs and what has to be done.
If Trump, I'm just wondering if one follow-up, if Sanders were not running against Trump, but against a more traditional Republican, do you think he would carry more voters?
Oh, no, I don't think so. I think he might have a chance against Trump because there's such a well of hatred against him. And, you could see it in 2018, a party that was experiencing higher employment. The rate of unemployment had gone down from Trump's time. It was it was like 3% or 4%. Would not lose the House of Representatives. I think that there are a lot of people who voted for Trump who thought that when he became president, he would sand off the rough edges and be a different kind of guy, and that he would be the president on behalf of everyone. And, I say that was true of George W. Bush. I mean, I don't support what he did, but again, he was a normal president. Trump is not a normal president. And the 2018 election was very much a referendum against him. I think if somebody like Kasich had run in 2016 against Hillary Clinton, he might have won the popular vote as well as the electoral vote. I think the Democrats were very vulnerable at that point.
All right, so with that note, we are actually going to close off the Q&A period because we are getting up right on time. But I just wanted to thank all of you for the interesting questions here. It brought out a variety of views and on this very important subject. But John, on behalf of Braver Angels, on behalf of everybody here, I'd like to thank you as well for joining us tonight. I, for one, learned a lot in the course of this experience. Not all stuff I agreed with, but all stuff that I found fascinating and stuff that I hope to spend time thinking on and mulling over. John, thank you for being here with us. And everybody, don't go just yet. We have a few short announcements. But John, thank you for a wonderful evening.
And thank you for having me and for all those difficult questions. So some of which were really Lulus. So,
well, so we are Ibrahim. If you could go ahead and post up the link to John's book again in the chat for everybody, in case anybody's interested in acquiring it and taking a look. Everybody, I am just going to give a couple final announcements as we finish up here. So we at Braver Angels work to engage the most difficult topics in American public life. We've covered everything from questions on racism to questions on the relations of men and women in society to questions on the very nature of American identity. These are things that do not have a nice, fuzzy, kind of feel-good kind of resolution that everybody comes to. They are things where there are very many diverse questions and diverse perspectives on how things work. But in the end, we of Braver Angels do believe that people with very distinct views and very distinct ways of approaching the world can come together in good faith and learn a little bit more from each other and from the just broader chorus of the union all these diverse perspectives than they can just on their own. That's, if that's not possible, then there may be something that we have to work on. But I think that is what I hope to work on in the America's Public Forum events and in Braver Angels events more generally. So I appreciate all of you joining us tonight. I just want to give a quick last word to Timothy Schaffer, who is the coordinator for one of the orgs partnering with us, the National Institute for Civil Discourse. So Tim, would you like to talk a little bit about NICD and the APF?
Yeah, I was just going to say very briefly, thanks very much, John, for the presentation tonight. NICD is, I think, a really grateful partner here with the America's Public Forum, and in similar ways to Braver Angels, trying to build and kind of cultivate spaces. So NICD.arizona.edu points to a lot of our projects, kind of the programs such as engaging differences, and especially this year, Golden Rule 2020 is something trying to engage those from faith backgrounds across the spectrum. So I would encourage you, as everyone who's trying to engage and think about these questions of how do we engage across our political spectrum, utilizing the various resources that are available from Braver Angels as well as NICD and a number of, frankly, other organizations who are really committed to this work as well. So thanks to John for the presentation tonight and for the discussion, Q&A, and to Luke, you for the great facilitation. Thanks so much. And remember, the link for the National Institute for Civil Discourse is in the chat now. We're also going to put a link to our third partner for the event this evening, which is a magazine called American Purpose. American Purpose is a relatively new magazine in DC policy world that tries to, in similar ways to what Braver Angels and NICD are doing, tries to bring a variety of voices into the picture to figure out what exactly we Americans all share together. And I have found their both their writings and their public events to be quite interesting and useful, and I look forward to partnering with them alongside NICD on more of these moving forward into the future. Now, as a very last announcement, Braver Angels is working to do as much as we can to help Americans get through this forthcoming election season, which, in case you hadn't heard, is getting more and more interesting every day for all sorts of reasons. It's nobody's fault in particular. It's something that we all are experiencing and going through, and I'm sure it's something that we'll remember for many years after this one. So if you're interested in joining us to work within your local community, perhaps, or perhaps with our national team on some of our events that we're planning for the day after Election Day and the month and the many months after Election Day and all the years onward from there. If you'd like to work with us on our Hold America Together events or on our With Malice Toward None events, things that we'll be doing right after the election to help Americans of diverse political opinions who are feeling many different ways about whatever is about to happen, still see the value in each other as Americans, we invite you to join us over at the Braver Angels link, braverangels.org. We're always looking for volunteers. My colleagues here, Tim is with NICD, but my colleagues Dennis and Ibrahim are volunteers. I'm a volunteer. We're all just here because we love this. We learn a lot, and we find it to be a wonderful and perhaps even a patriotic thing to do in these strange times where it's harder and harder for us Americans to talk to each other and to live together. And so with that, from our beloved community at Braver Angels to yours, thank you for joining us this evening, everybody. Have a wonderful night. Thank you, everybody, and God bless.